another point that I want to make is the patient point. Why do I think medical devices are so fascinating? And my really kind of the most important experience I ever had in my medical device career was we developed this transesophageal echocardiography probe. First, it was an annular array, also quite complex electromechanical ultrasound probe to swallow to get an image from the heart. And we did that in Trondheim, and then moved it to Lingmed Sound in Horten and started to do the manufacturing. And we were in the first clinical, and we were going to do the first patient. This was at Ullevål University Hospital in Oslo. We were standing there, and we were waiting for the first patient. And through the door comes my high school math teacher as the patient. So, and I designed that temperature sensor inside that probe. So I remember that room it just got compressed. It got much smaller, and I had to get out. I remember I couldn't be in there, and I was thinking about what could go wrong. And he was a great math teacher, and I had a lot of respect for him. So, but it all went well, and but the point is that the medical devices we are developing is going to be used on your high school math teacher or your, someone's father, mother, uncle. So it's about people, and so this is that experience to me was truly transformational. Was truly understanding how important these devices are for people, and one day I will need a medical device myself. So one day I will be the patient, and that also is quite inspiring, I think, in developing something new.
Welcome to the Message Engineer for the Medtech Startup Show. I am Maureen Shaffer, your host, and today I'm excited to introduce Jon Hoem. Jon is a serial CEO and co-founder with more than 30 years of Class IIb and 3 medical device experience, primarily in cardiac surgery and interventional cardiology. I had the great pleasure of working with him at AtriCure when he was running Europe and I was running marketing. So Jon is currently the CEO of Pacertool, a medtech startup focused on predicting and optimizing response to cardiac resynchronization therapy, or CRT. Jon has a master's degree in microelectronics and organizational development from the Norwegian University of Science and Technology, and is joining us today from his home in Zurich. So, Jon, thank you so much for joining us today on the Message Engineer Podcast.
Thank you, Maureen, for having me. It's a great pleasure, and I always look back of all the things you learned me when I was at AtriCure. So that was a lot of fun, and I remember I took all the material I could get from the US and brought it to Europe and tried to reproduce what AtriCure and what you were building in the US. So you did a good job and excellent job there. So thank you. I look back to those years with fond memory.
Thank you. It's very kind of you to say. So thanks again for joining us.
Sure.
So one of the things I do when I start this is do something called define the word warm-up, where I offer up a couple of words and ask you to provide your kind of like response or reflection on what that means to you in the context of kind of medtech startups. So with that, you ready?
I think I am. What's the first word?
Message.
Ooh, message. Well, I'm first of all, I have to frame it a little bit. Remember, I'm not a marketing expert in any way. I'm an engineer of training, and I loved it. Did that for my first 5-6 years in a professional medtech company in Norway called Mingletoe. And then by chance, I got into sales and marketing. And so I learned that the hard way, on the street, basically cold calling in the beginning, and tried to do the transition from being an engineer to going to sales and marketing. So that journey was maybe my toughest transition in my whole career, going from engineering to sales and marketing. But I really enjoyed it. So message to me is, of course, for me, it is to understand your customer, number one. Understand the product you have and how to frame it in a way where it's easily to be communicated. And some of the products that I've developed and been so fortunate to develop and being co-founder of several companies are quite complex technologies where you are coming with a new concept of what you're going to do, how you're going to change what you're doing, and why. And I remember very well when we started the first pitch and the sales pitches in medicine, which was an intraoperative flow meter for cardiac surgeons. And we went to multiple professors in cardiac surgery in Europe. And I went in and said, why should you measure your coronary bypass flows? And the reaction was like immediately the same across all these professors in cardiac surgery was, I don't need that. I don't need to measure my flows. Every flow is perfect. And I couldn't understand it. I mean, we had this great innovation. It was clearly something they needed. It is to verify what you're already doing, and that is to, do an anastomosis proximal and then distal and measure the flow in it. So, of course, you want to measure the flow. And they said, no, I don't need it at all. And then I learned it on pushback and on the messaging. I learned it the fun way. When you get that kind of a pushback, I learned to go, well, you might not need it, but maybe your resident will need it. And that was the sales pitch that we used after that. And it was, I don't know if I really answer your question with regard to messaging, but I think it learned me something that is very important, and that is what you think is obvious to you, which is, is a must thing that you have to do as a professional, is not obvious to the customer that you try to sell. So today I spend a lot of time to understand what the right messaging is, and you can call it positioning as well, and how to position a new technology to a market that maybe have never used it, because we are trying to fundamentally in medical devices and medicine with a new product, we're trying to change the way things are done one way or another. So you're affecting the workflow one way or another. So understanding that whole workflow, how your product fits into that workflow and how all the stakeholders are going to win, figuring that thing out from a messaging perspective requires a lot of work and a lot of discussions and a lot of customer meetings to really get that messaging and that positioning right. So that's maybe my conclusion today. Something that I thought was very, very simple in the beginning is just go out and sell what you have. It is getting more and more complex, and you need to nail the messages not only to the professors of the world, but also more and more to the nurses who will support the cases, to the circulating nurses, to the scrub nurse, to everyone in that cath lab or the OR, and of course, more and more importantly, to the payers and the administrators in that hospital. So the picture is, it's getting much more complex than when I was starting to try to sell these flow meters. And figuring that equation out is challenging, but it's also a lot of fun.
some great points you made in there about what may seem I'm paraphrasing, but what may seem obvious to you, not you, but like, we think is obvious about a product or service when we go out there to the customer and talk to them about it, is not obvious to them, right? So it's so critical to, as you pointed out, I love that you have to go out and talk to them and listen to what they're reflecting back to you and work to find like what is that message? Like the one that you landed on was, could this be something that your residents, because you are the best at what you do, you wouldn't, of course, need to validate the quality of your anastomoses. Well, what about your resident? What about the person not at an academic teaching hospital, right? So I think that idea of how you ask that and how you figure that out and how you work through that is really critical to the message. And also the idea that you pointed out of the increasing kind of influence of other people in the kind of customer ecosystem is very critical to understanding how things are going to work. And then the third thing that I thought that it was a great point was the idea of workflow and understanding. I find that very underappreciated. The idea of where does whether it's the patient or right, where does the patient come from? Where are they going to? How and why? And like you said, the workflow, particularly in the OR, what happens when and how and why. You can't just say, hey, this is going to work great and it's going to help you with this, and not understand who does what, when, why, how, and have adoption go particularly well. So
Yeah.
Great. I love your response to that.
Oh, thank you. I think it's just fascinating to see how that has evolved. And also, we talk a lot about MDR and how difficult MDR has become for especially startups in Europe and also American startups. But one thing that it has really done is to focus on workflow. It has really kind of put the focus and emphasis on usability and how this will be adapted across multiple stakeholders in the cath lab or in the OR.
Yeah, that's a whole. We'll come back to usability because I think that that is a critical conversation to have. So I have to give you at least another word.
Okay, I'm ready.
And so you mentioned it. You mentioned already this transition that you made from engineering to sales, and what you learned about messaging. So the next word is marketing.
Oh, okay. So that's even more difficult, I think. Well, there I don't have very, very good answers to marketing. But to me, it is important to get the message across to your customers one way or another. So you can look at this from, the big marketing campaigns that have been run in the Medtronic or Abbott or Boston Scientific, clearly out of scope for any startup. We cannot do that. Then you can go all the way down to the sales rep and think about how they position their products, which is, I think, is part of that marketing approach. But what I found more and more, and this is also something we did actually in AtriCure, based on what I learned from what AtriCure did in the US. But we transported the thinking around how you do training of physicians. And for me, getting physicians trained in a new procedure is not directly marketing, it's much more sales. But that's the most effective way I've seen to launch new products. I've not seen, excuse me if I'm offending you, but I've not really seen marketing campaigns work extremely well in smaller companies. But I've seen, and I'm coming from a pure startup perspective now, I've seen companies do extremely well on education and training. And so if marketing can support that sales effort of how we in the field can be good and executing on sales and training, that converts to me to sales. So listening to my answer, I guess I'm more on the sales side than on the marketing side. And a good communication between the marketing responsible and head of sales is, of course, crucial. And you, before I came on board in AtriCure, you had already established that with Rich, which was, to me, worked really, really great. And I took that, moved it to Europe, and implemented a training program for cardiac surgeons at the University Clinic of Barcelona, which still is working today. I mean, the program is still ongoing. I think now trained more than 250, must be maybe even 500 cardiac surgeons in that program, both in closed chest and open chest ablation. And the program really works. They get the material, they get to discuss the technology, they discuss different approaches for surgical treatment of AF, minimal invasively and open heart, and now also more and more with the left ventricular appendage clip. And that was a great marriage between sales and marketing. And when you get that to work, then you have just an enormous power to penetrate the market, as you did in AtriCure, and we did in AtriCure.
Yeah, so one, thanks again for kind of walking back through the AtriCure example, and that idea of, I think, training and education it's so critical, right? Because that's what medicine, right? People in medicine have done a lot of, right? Years and years and years.
Exactly.
Of training and education. And so could you talk a little bit more about why you think or where you've seen that be really powerful? Like why does that work better than some flashy marketing campaign?
Oh, to me, at the end of the day, it is to get the customer to use your product on patient and help patient in a safe and responsible manner. So, of course, this goes back to making sure that your technologies are applied according to the instruction for use, are used according to how the intended use is. That's one point of securing outcomes, especially when you are talking about clinical trials. So how do you ensure that clinical trials are successful without training? I mean, that's of course impossible. And we did, especially on the closed chest side, we did proctorships, as you remember well, where we flew in experienced cardiac surgeons to support new users of the technology. And this was not simple. I mean, this is probably the most complex procedure in cardiac surgery that I've seen. Now it's been much more refined, developed. The innovators back then are still working on it. They're developing this, like Professor Salzberg here in Zurich. So that's really fascinating to see. But to come back to your question, why do I think that is the most effective way? I think it positions you well to competition, number one, because it gives them the perspective that you want good for the physicians, for their patients, and they get to train on your product, which is fine. But it's also enabling them to discuss what is the latest science, where are we coming from, where are we going with this technology, how can we combine catheter ablation with surgical ablation in these patients. I mean, all of these discussions, all of these debate of what is the right approach of using and applying this technology, I don't think we could advance that field as far as we've done today without letting the physicians discuss and debate and find solutions. And that is something that comes through these training programs, which is, there are so many facets to this. You can really never beat this from any marketing campaign The sales part of it is, letting your customers come with their sales rep or their distributors to the training session, have a social frame around it at the same time as you are really working on the product and learning new approaches to how to use the product. So I've just seen that is, in my experience, the most effective way to launch products anywhere in the world, if that's Japan, the US, or Europe.
Great point. And I think you've touched on a couple of things that are interesting about that, right? That it stays it keeps conversation it facilitates a conversation for starters, right? Amongst people who have more experience and people who are interested in, right, starting. And it develops that kind of network, right? As well, it's almost networking in a bit of a way, right? And expanding, kind of getting that, how should I say it, almost like mind share, or some of the best minds thinking together, right, about how to do this and where to do this. I'm wondering if you think, so it makes me think of, I know in the past when I've launched kind of, I've been in companies where we launch very novel products, right, like AtriCure, that oftentimes there are individuals who want to do the like most, how should I say it? Not a mainstream case. They want to choose a very difficult or an outlier type of case. I don't know how else to phrase that. And do you think the training and education helps kind of level set, physicians, surgeons, et cetera, on kind of like how to educate themselves when they get back to their institutions, like where to start, what to try next, how to think about that? I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that.
Well, just to take one point that you were touching upon, which I think is important, and that is, if you look at the two positioning points of, hey, why don't you want to use this flow meter, compared to, let's discuss how we use this flow meter, right?
Right.
And that is a non. I mean, none of us wants to be in a confrontational spot when we buy anything for starting with. Yeah, I mean, we want to buy it because we like the product, we like the people, we believe in the technology, we believe in the outcomes, right? I mean,
Right.
this is why we buy something. I mean, everyone has a buying experience, and buying a new car, buying a house, whatever. And it's the same thing. I mean, you want to do this, and there are emotions involved and so on. But you want to do it also when it's non-confrontational. So you want to be able to have a peer discussion, or at least a professional discussion, with the company representatives, if that's sales reps or engineers. Being an engineer myself, I think that engineers have a lot to both contribute in the discussion, but also to take away from that customer interaction back to what they are doing at home, in the lab or in the development. And most of the drives I've seen, with it on a tangent, is really driven by engineers in the field of medical devices. But to come back to your question of preventing outliers and selecting the right patient for the right procedure at the right time, which is a Pacertool slogan, but still it's it's one of those things that are important. I think it could. I think the physicians will not go for, at least these days, they will not go for the outliers. They will not go for the difficult cases, if that is not part of a protocol. Now, if you look at minimal invasive heart valves, and everyone that observed that field and how that evolved knows that it was a inoperative patient, a patient that couldn't go on a heart valve machine, that got the first minimal invasive heart valve. So clearly the strategy was to focus on the non-operative patients that couldn't go through open heart surgery, and then move from there, which was an extremely effective launch strategy. And you see how that field has exploded and covering more and more patients. So that is a very effective strategy, but in general, for smaller segments and for technologies that are complex, and all of these technologies are complex, I think training could definitely have the physicians agree on what the right patient cohort is. You can do that in the training session, or you can do that in your scientific advisory board meetings, where you can have those discussions of what are the right patients we're going to treat, when are we going to treat them, what's the selection process, what are the endpoints that we're going to go after for this clinical trial or overall for the field. So again, it's training session for me is a way to have a professional discussion about very complex issues without being confrontational about that you have to use this product, because no one wants to use a product if that's the framing of why you should use it. I mean, you use it because you want to, you believe it will help your patient over time. So I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that idea of it is it's a conversation, right? It's not how many times can I hit, to be kind of crass, but how many times can I hit someone over the head with what I want them to do, right? That's not how this goes.
Exactly.
It's a conversation about science. It's a conversation about patient selection. It's a conversation about what the fit is.
Yeah.
To your comment about you always say the right message at the right time to the right people.
Yeah.
So that makes the training education piece makes a lot of sense. If we think about clinicals, right? You started to talk about training education and kind of clinicals and protocols.
Yeah.
And to that extent, how do you think through kind of, there always seems to be this tension between, and it's a conversation internally that I've been involved in, where regulatory is like, look, this is the easiest indication for us to get initially and get in the market.
Yeah.
And marketing's like, but the one we want is this one over here. And there has to be time and money and that conversation about where's the middle ground and how do we think about that? And what kind of, a lot of times as well, clinical, if it's a separate function, the size and length of the trial, right? To prove a specific point. So and all of that gets to the message that can be kind of conveyed, right? The claims and the message that can be conveyed when you go to market and commercialize.
Right.
So how have you thought, what are your insights for how to think about that, how to balance that out? What's the right approach to that?
Well, I don't think there is one right approach to that. And as you know, these discussions are in companies, are small or large, it doesn't matter really, are very intense. And very, very important and maybe that's why they get so intense, because everyone, sales, marketing, regulatory quality, has a role in that discussion. Everyone are looking at something they believe is the same, but it's not from their perspective. All of the different professionals have a different view of what they need in that process. We are in the midst of that now in Pacertool, where we are trying to pan out, number one, what's the end game, right? And there is one additional element which is, of course, very important. That is, how are we going to get paid for our devices? So how do we make sure that reimbursement is part of that overall strategy? So number one, where it all starts, it starts with the safety for the patients. So that's kind of obvious. You need to make sure that your first clinical trials are ensuring that this device is safe. And yeah, anyone in this field knows that the first step in that process is kind of a must thing that you have to do, is the safety feasibility study. So that's a given. I think everyone will agree that yes, we need to do a safety feasibility study. The question is how many patients? Well, it could be 20, it could be 30. You need input from maybe your notified body. You need to discuss the endpoints maybe with the FDA, or at least in your scientific advisory reports, we understand what the endpoints are. But that's kind of a no-go, or absolutely go. This is something you have to do. So now you go and you do the safety feasibility, and it's on some kind of, and I love to do this, which is the claim for this is a tool claim. And this is a proven strategy that we have used long time. We started with that in medicine, and I've used that for all my companies. And the tool claim says something very simple. It says, I can measure coronary flow, I can measure a pressure, I can measure something that I need accurately enough. So I can measure it accurately. Fine. So what you need to prove to the regulators is, well, on the benchtop testing that you do, I need to show that I can measure these accurately. And in a clinical trial, you need to do the same. That's kind of the first step. And this you can take to an larger observational study of 60 or 100 patients maybe, to get the initial data set, clinical data set. The difficulty comes in when you come into the bigger trials. So how do you set yourself up to get to the randomized clinical trial that you need for reimbursement? And now, from a regulatory perspective, you need to make sure that the regulators buy into your endpoints. You need to make sure that they agree that the data that you generated already will support a randomized clinical trial. And you are now talking about the clinical endpoint, and this is where marketing and sales are coming very importantly in, and reimbursement. I think when we look at that whole road, that whole journey, the end game, you need to focus on the end game. The end game is to get your product on the market with a clinical claim that supports your reimbursement strategy and secures your own reimbursement. That's the end game. How to get there, how many patients, when, in which centers, in which geographies, is part of this constant, excuse me, the constant debate that goes on in the company to figure out that road. And it gets very intense because the whole company rides on this clinical strategy. So when investors ask me, well, what is the highest risk in your company? It generally comes down to exactly this point. It comes down to how you implement, how you design your clinical strategy to an end position that everyone believes in, that's where we want to be at the end of the day. It can be a long road. With MiraCore, one of the companies that I started or was part of the starting team in MiraCore, it's been a very long journey. Actually, in these days, they're going to publish a randomized double-blind clinical data for a technology to improve microcirculation in acute heart attack patients. And that kind of technology is extremely complex. So you are trying to change the workflow in the cath lab for acute heart attack patients that are undergoing a stent, where everyone has been talking about door-to-balloon times and so on. So you're trying to get in there in order to improve the microcirculation long term, and you want to show that this endpoint of infarct size reduction at 5 days, that holds true in a randomized clinical trial. And when you talk to anyone that has been part of this journey, it's 14 years since we started the company, 2008. And the data on the randomized trial is still not out. It's been a very, very long journey with a lot of professional input to that whole journey. And it's basically nail-biting excitement right now to see what that data is going to come out like. And so for everyone that has seen that and observed it and lived it, it's not only intense now, but it's been intense the whole time from we did the first in-man study in Europe until this randomized clinical trial in 144 patients. So it's very fascinating to see how long these journeys have become. Part of this is, of course, the clearer you are in the beginning of what you need to do, the quicker you can execute. So that's clear, and we need to compress and be better at compressing those timelines. That's very
I love when you're talking about knowing what the end game is and being very clear about that, and then kind of backing it up with all the input that from all the different groups that need to kind of align, clinicals, reimbursement, right? Design, clinical, reimbursement, in order to get the right outcome at the end of the day, the right claims, reimbursement for those claims, that you have to kind of project the future a bit and make sure you have the right input at the front in order to hit those marks, and that they can take a long time, like you're talking about with Miracore in 14 years. So
yeah, and I think to me that input is really important. So teaming up with professionals early on to get the right input, I find that invaluable. And just listening to physicians, how they talk about the technologies and how it could fit into their practice is, of course, totally fascinating. And of course, we want to be part of that whole journey. Sometimes those discussions also are difficult because they need to be aligned on where we want to go. But the earlier in a startup or emerging medical device company, as I like to call them, the earlier you can get this input, the quicker you can get to pan out that whole, hopefully not that long as 14 years, but that whole journey you can define, talk about and discuss in your board and discuss among your stakeholders internally and externally.
I think that's a key point about compressing timelines, because ultimately that goes to something that you and I were talking about kind of before the call, and that is investors, right? So if you think you start with, I always say start with the end in mind. You're talking about end game, same thing, right? But if you start with the end in mind, you think about the end game very thoroughly at the beginning, which takes a lot of time and effort and stakeholders, as you pointed out. Then there's the potential, right? There are always bumps in the road, but then there's the potential, you were saying, to then compress that timeline in a thoughtful way, velocity, compress. And investors, right? That means money money faster, get their return back faster.
Right. And we're sitting here in October 2022, and it's probably the most difficult financing climate I've seen in my whole career. And when we closed the first financing round in Miracore, that was in August 2008. And in September, the market went south. I mean, it was just, we closed the month before. And now we are here, and this market is brutal from an entrepreneur perspective. It's very, very hard to raise funds. It's very hard to get your message, again, coming back to your message, get your message through to the right people, to the right investors that believe in you, in the company, where we're heading. So I think this is crucial to understand what the investors need in order to be comfortable in putting their money into the company. And this discussion is, of course, part of that investor discussion is when or what do we need to show in order to get to our exit? And there will be normally many exit time points in that whole journey. And they are mostly related to clinical. So if you meet the corporates, they will immediately ask you, well, when is your first in man? So everyone is thinking clinical. You need to know that timeline, and you need to articulate to your current investors and your future investors that this will create value. But what I found more and more, which I think also is a very fascinating thought process, is when you think about clinical or you think about an asset or a technology, what would the corporates do when they have that asset? What would a Medtronic do, or an Abbott or a Boston Scientific do when they are sitting on that asset? And asking that question creates a whole other thought process in the company. People are starting to think, okay, we need to be more strategic, we need to be more clear, more focused to get to that end game. So it helps that internal discussion to compress that timeline, both from an investor perspective, but also at the end of the day, one of these companies are going to hopefully want to buy the asset, and then they want to see that we understood that whole journey, and it makes important, important milestones or important progress across that whole line. And so that's how I think about that journey, trying to frame it from a corporate perspective, trying to compress it, so being earlier to discuss the difficult points very early, and getting quickly to that clinical strategy that can get you to value, and at the end of the day also help patients to live better lives.
Corporate, compressed, clinicals. Little alliteration always makes it easy to remember. So I love that idea of thinking through that, right? Because people want to know what the comparables look like. It's like selling a house. What do the comparables look like? Who's exited how? Because in far and away in medtech, right, for decades now, the exit is some kind of M&A. It's not some kind of merger acquisition. It's not an IPO. Far and away. That's unusual. AtriCure is kind of an unusual one in that category, from that perspective. So how do you think through not just the exit, but you're talking about corporate and the fit, right? This kind of end game, and then at the front end, this idea of corporate and clinicals and compression. How do you think about corporate from the front end? Do you kind of match it up against 3 of the billion-dollar global companies and say, how might this work? How would we think about this differently? And try to project like who else are going to buy in the meantime and what they may look like, or what's kind of your thought process on that?
Now, I think every one of us will agree that you cannot build a company for an exit. Every one of us will agree to that. So it's clear, it's impossible to understand what that exit will look like. So you need to, at the same time as you are thinking about your milestones and thinking about possible value inflection points and takeoff points, you need to build and think about building a company as if you were actually going to sell devices in the market. So you need to have that thought in your mind as well. You need to understand, if I had that in my bag, how would I be successful as a sales rep? So that's part of that thinking. But I think it comes back to where we started, of talking to your customers and talking to the corporates. And again, this is networking. It is talking to as many professionals, salespeople, marketing executives, and management in the larger corporate. For startups, I think it's very, very important to absolutely know crystal clear where the need is in the different companies you're talking to. All of them have different experiences, have different setups, have different technologies in their bag that could be a fit, or where you can fit in better than in others. So you need to understand that positioning statement. Again, comes back to talking to the to the corporates, but being able to have the right message to different of these corporates, which could be different. And this is very hard for a small startup or a small company to do. Again, the secret to this is to set up meetings, start talking to the corporates quite early, actually, again, to compress the timelines, and ask them what are the critical parts of the takeout. And the answers that we get back are very different and very surprising. Some of them are not even talking about clinical. They take clinical, regulatory, quality as given, right? It's, of course, you have to have that. It's kind of, that's the basics. For us, that's still, several mountains or hurdles to climb, but this is, the corporates will look at it much more, how can I scale this product in my market and with my sales force? How can I use this opportunity of this market to capture market share, to be more profitable, and to be able to sell more of maybe my current devices into a very competitive market? And understanding that bit and just the scalability part is, of course, a big challenge, because that goes back to manufacturing, goes back to development. Who do you partner with in order to do your development and manufacturing? All of that together, and that answer is kind of surprising that corporates are willing to pay more if you have a scalable asset than the prototype. It's kind of clear, but very few companies are putting in huge efforts or use resources to do process validation, for instance. I mean, process validation, we are not very good at that in startups. We should, excuse me, because the companies are telling us that they will pay more if we have a scalable product that can be manufactured safely and in larger volumes when we get there. But of course, there are trade-offs here. And going to the board of a startup, to your investors, and say, hey, I need 5 million to do process validation, is not going to fly. So that's, again, you need to get that balance between what is asked by the corporate and where you are in that whole discovery of understanding the clinical benefit and the regulatory pathway and the reimbursement.
Yeah, so it's fascinating that in addition to the group of folks we typically see as customers, right, and then these additional kind of influencers who are weighing in more heavily on these decisions from the kind of provider, clinical, medical side of things, that thinking through how a corporate, kind of ultimate end game, but corporate ultimate end game, thinking through scale, like can they take your proof of principle, what you've done, what you've proven, and can they just basically add cash and multiply it, right? Add more marketing, add more people, add more more manufacturing money and multiply it. And how does it allow them to sell, gain share, right? So scale, share. You had a third one, and then it was like sales adjacencies. Like, does it help them sell more of what they already have? And so really, so they're a customer, right? Essentially, of a different type, right? Like investors are, to take into consideration.
Yeah. And I found these conversations, normally they are at conferences over a cup of coffee or in the meeting room. Even half an hour, it's amazing how much information you get out of those conversations. And I think if you can convert just part of that in order to think what's the effective way, who's the right partner for you, short could be a potential investor as well. And you will find that out very quickly when you talk to me. So again, starting early, having those conversations, and continue to feed information on what you achieve to the corporates, I think is a true proven way to get your message across.
Your third point was profitability. I just remembered. Scale, share, profitability, sales adjacencies, like ability to.
Yeah. And this I learned the hard way also in Medtronic when we launched medicine in the US. So it is very hard for a company coming in with a technology into a corporate. And where you're part of a bag. I mean, these sales reps, of course, they have multiple products in the bag. And you will not be successful if you cannot get to at least 20% minimum of their sales volume, of their quota. Because that is exactly what they need in order to hit their quota, in order to get their bonus. So if you are struggling to get to 5% or 10% of that bag of their revenue, you are stuck. I mean, you cannot scale and you cannot expand. So you need to get to that where the sales representatives understand that if I take this on board with a relatively low effort relative for a new breakthrough technology, I can get 20% more revenue out of all my customers, and it will be a fun process. It will be interesting. I will build my relationship over time, relationships I couldn't have before with my current bag. So that is a very, very important aspect of being successful. So if you can find that way of how you fill the bag of sales reps with 20% or more of what they're already selling, I think that is what you need to find out as a start.
That's really fascinating. I've always considered sales a customer of marketing, because it doesn't matter how great the product is, if they don't want to sell it, I mean, they are not sales. I have the utmost amount of respect for sales. And they are, how should I say it? I have found in my experience that the compensation needs to exceed the effort required, right? And they need to, as you said, right, just as you said, to kind of trust that this is going to expand the relationship or grow the relationship or allow them to have new relationships that kind of benefit them long term. And it's critical to be able to tell that story, and have it be real, but tell that story and make that happen in order to get it moving and not just be kind of a dead on the shelf.
Yeah, and that I'm touching upon sales. I think we have the same experience now. Again, I fell into sales and I love sales, and I'm very respectful as you of the professional medical device sales representatives out there, and they are doing an amazing job. I still remember from working with the Medtronic sales force in cardiac surgery how some of these top performer sales representatives would come to your training. I mean, remember, this is a small Norwegian company coming to the US, and it's like you're opening a black box and you see, wow, this is a big place, right? It's just a huge place. How do you attack that? And then in the first training session, we have sent out material, and of course, you know very well that from a marketing perspective, we don't expect salespeople to have read through that when you do the training. I mean, they will come. I mean, most of us, I mean, salespeople or not, will probably not just have the time or find the time to read through the material. But the top salespeople will come to your training session and they read through all your clinical, all your articles. And they will ask pretty difficult questions that you probably didn't think about before you launch your product. Remember, this is a Norwegian company coming to the US without any sales traction in the US at all. So having those conversations with the sales reps and working with them, being out in the field, seeing how they were able to convert customers was truly inspirational for me. And I always remember those instances where the sales reps were going out there having, as they called the come to Jesus meeting, after trying to convert this account for a year. I mean, they were at it for a year to convert the account, and they converted the whole account in one day. And it's elegant, it is professional, and it's unfortunate that, you know, where I'm coming from, like Norway, a sales rep is not given any credit at all. I mean, it's not a profession that anyone respects. Whereas when you see it professionally implemented, as you can see in Europe or in the US or Japan, I've seen it in Japan as well. It's truly amazing to see how these sales reps are converting your idea, your product into revenue.
And another critical customer, right? Not just thinking through corporate at the beginning and clinical and all the other necessary, right, reimbursement, et cetera, but thinking through, right, how is this going to impact them? How will, you know, they on the corporate side be able to do that kind of 20% rule that you talked about, where this will make up a significant part of what they can sell? How does it elevate their relationships or expand the relationships? I think are really critical kind of insights from this perspective, particularly coming in, like you said, as a small startup from, you know, Norway, for example, to, you know, to the US, where you didn't have kind of any traction. Yeah, that's fascinating. And it's fascinating to hear that the top reps did kind of consume the material in advance and prepare in advance. We're the most prepared, right? So it says a lot about the kind of activities, right, that the top people do.
And this, especially one Brian Thorson in Milwaukee, I remember him because he did exactly that. He was so amazing, and he's still selling products today, I know, and he's doing a fabulous job. But he learned me so much about how you, as a professional sales rep, understand your product, understand your customer, and then have this, as they say in German, Fingerspitzengefühl, have this feeling of, okay, when is the right point to push? When is not the right point, time point to push? Mm-hmm. And it's a lot we're touching about on psychology here, of course, but and I don't really believe that they are born sales reps. I mean, sales is a professional activity that you learn over time. And the best sales reps, they have this amazing feel of when they're going to go in and get the business and when they should not. And observing that real life, real time, was for me an amazing experience. Again, coming out of Norway back in 2000.
Yeah, great experience, great insights into the things to consider at the beginning of this, you know, as early on as possible in the consideration of a startup, or you're saying emerging kind of medical device or med tech company. And yeah, to save time, to know what you're going to study clinically, to understand how it lines up with corporate, all of that, right? So that is super helpful. Are there any Did you look back, kind of any mistakes or missteps that you made as relates to kind of messaging and by marketing and also kind of like product management that were critical to kind of getting to where you are today or understanding what you understand today?
I think, the first startup, so when the first CEO position in AtriCure was totally fascinating for me. I learned a lot, but I didn't understand how important it was to compress that timeline for the stakeholders. So if I would do, and I'm doing that again in Pacertool, and I you get a little bit hooked on this startup because it's so fascinating to do it again. And hopefully, when you do it again, you can do it, compress the time, be even faster to the decision, challenge your current thinking. That is the number one thing that I didn't understand in the beginning, how important that is. That was clearly a mistake, and that's one part of it. The other part of it is when you talk about stakeholders, understanding in the company that there are so many stakeholders, both internally. I mean, in Pacertool, we are a young, founded in 2019, startup company, emerging medical device company, sorry. And we are learning to work together, right? And we're learning how to make sure that we are ticking all the boxes as quickly as we can. And we're an engineering-based company. It's engineers that are driving this together with the physician. So this fascination of having engineers that are converting the vision of the founder, Hans-Henrik Hovland, to something that over time will develop into something bigger. I think if you could get that right with quite intense communication internally between the employees on all levels. I mean, we're doing a very advanced device with a Class III catheter and a console or a single amplifier and the software. So that's a complex device. And getting that all put together, getting the input from everyone, and then making sure that the board is properly informed, knows what we're doing, where we're heading, and converting that to a communication strategy outside. I think that's what still makes me so fascinated about the field. And I'm not perfect at it in any way, but I learn and try to learn from the mistakes I'm making. I'm trying to be a little bit better every process we're going through to make sure that we have a better outcome. So that's one. But another point that I want to make is the patient point. Why do I think medical devices are so fascinating? And my really kind of the most important experience I ever had in my medical device career was we developed this transesophageal echocardiography probe. First, it was an annual array, also quite complex electromechanical ultrasound probe to swallow to get an image from the heart. And we did that in Trondheim, and then moved it to Lingmed Sound in Horten and started to do the manufacturing. And we were in the first clinical, and we were going to do the first patient. This was at Ullevål University Hospital in Oslo. We were standing there, and we were waiting for the first patient. And through the door comes my high school math teacher as the patient. So, and I designed that temperature sensor inside that probe. So I remember that room it just got compressed. It got much smaller, and I had to get out. I remember I couldn't be in there, and I was thinking about what could go wrong. And he was a great math teacher, and I had a lot of respect for him. So, but it all went well, and but the point is that the medical devices we are developing is going to be used on your high school math teacher or your, someone's father, mother, uncle. So it's about people. And so this is that experience to me was truly transformational, was truly understanding how important these devices are for people. And one day I will need a medical device myself. So one day I will be the patient. And that also is quite inspiring, I think, in developing something new and trying to move the medical field forward. So that's what just totally today makes me very enthusiastic about the field, seeing the new technologies coming, seeing how this transforms medical care in the world.
Yeah, really, really powerful. I think that idea that one, it's not, I used to say, if it's in your, if we're putting this in your grandmother, would you, right? That reflection, but to see someone right, and you respect and you want, that shifts it. And then to think, I love your idea of thinking about like someday, of knowing that someday we will be, right, I'll be a recipient of a medical device.
Yeah.
That ups the game. That sets a new high point to reach for.
Yeah, and that's that makes another aspect of this makes you quite humble in what you do, right? I mean, it kind of takes it down to a very personal level, and I think if we could bring that into companies with values that are important for the people in the company, the engineers and the management in the company, so that you live those values, I think that's going to go quite a long way.
Yeah, we talk about these things sometimes, as we did earlier in the conversation, not devoid of the patient perspective, but kind of more internally focused, right, and more kind of provider focused. And obviously, the whole reason we're doing any of this is for the patients, is for the healthcare consumers, is to improve their lives and improve outcomes. And so I haven't heard and someday I'll have a medical device. So that's great. I love that. So I think we're gonna wrap it up with that. I don't think it's gonna get any better than that. Was awesome. And I just have kind of one quick, kind of fun closing question. You've done a lot of travel, and of all your kind of like, are there any places or experiences or kind of travel hacks that you think are completely unappreciated that have been meaningful to you?
Oh, there are many places that I would never get to if I didn't do what I'm doing. So in the U.S., I traveled to. We lived in the U.S. for 5 years. Traveled to 40 states. Saw a ton of hospitals. Ton of people. I mean, fascinating country to see. I would say that the most fascinating culture to me and the most fascinating place I've ever been is Japan. Because Japan is a little bit like an onion. You look at an onion and you think that you understand it, right? And you peel off one part of it and you look at it again and you say, okay, maybe now I understand it a little bit better. But then there are more layers and more layers. And being in Japan, traveling Japan, going to hospitals from Hokkaido in north to Fukuoka in the south, that whole country was totally fascinating to me. The culture, the history of the place, the food, how they enjoy the food, how they have, even if it's a very structured country. I mean, It's a big one, and they are as structured and as planned as Switzerland is, which is totally amazing. If you go to any other country that is big, normally you don't have that kind of structure everywhere. Japan is and has that kind of structure. And the different things we saw in Japan. I remember we went to a restaurant outside Nagasaki, and we were having fish and sushi, of course. And we were eating live shrimp. I still remember this, picking up live shrimp from a bowl where they were swimming around, putting it into soy sauce and trying to eat them. And I think the Japanese are trying to test you. Do you accept the culture or not? Do you fully understand what this is about? I will never understand Japan, I think, because I don't speak the language. But I think Japan, to me, from Tokyo to the small places, is a beautiful place, a lot of history, amazing food, amazing people, hardworking, dedicated professionals. That, to me, was an amazing experience, and I will always bring that with me. I mean, of course, Switzerland is fantastic and clean and beautiful and works, all that, which I also love really there for 16 years now. But Japan, any of the places I've been is by far the most fascinating place I've been so far.
That's fantastic. So thank you so much for joining us today on the Message Engineer podcast, and really enjoyed the conversation, and thanks for taking the time. And that's it for now. We'll see you next time on the Message Engineer podcast.